Former FBI agent and professional investigator Bill Turner has been researching the JFK assassination since the weekend it happened. His exhaustive probing has given him exceptional insight into the events and reasons surrounding Kennedy's death.
There was much anger over his failure to provide air cover at the Bay of Pigs. There was much anger when he did not invade Cuba during the missile crisis in October 1962. After the Bay of Pigs, John Kennedy reamed out the CIA for conducting too high a profile, meaning an invasion. And he said he wanted to continue the campaign against Castro, but he wanted it so it was low profile and invisible. And so the Kennedy brothers did develop a secret agenda, and Bobby was a protagonist in which there would be a series of sabotage raids, there would be continued assassination attempts against Castro, and there would be teams ready to go into Cuba if the time was right for a second invasion. So all of this was low profile but high intensity and was going on right after the Bay of Pigs, right up until John Kennedy's death.
Building on the foundations laid by Bill Turner, using classified documents newly released under the Kennedy Assassination Records Act, the investigation into the Kennedy brothers' secret agenda against Fidel Castro has been greatly extended. Project Freedom is the name given to that agenda by two Atlantan writers and researchers. Over the last 7 years, Lamar Waldron has built up a formidable database on this secret agenda and its relationship to Kennedy's murder. Together with colleague Thom Hartmann, they have gained unique access to individuals closest to these events and have unraveled some of the darkest secrets lying at the heart of the assassination.
The Kennedys were determined to see some sort of action taken on Cuba, one way or the other, before the end of 1963, primarily because they wanted to avoid Cuba becoming a political football during the 1964 campaigns, and those would, of course, be kicking off at the first of the year 1964.
The reason that this came about was the efforts against Castro, of course, started in 1959 under Richard Nixon. Nixon wildly escalated them in 1960 in an attempt to have Castro assassinated prior to the election so that he could defeat Kennedy in the election. He was unsuccessful in that. Kennedy inherited many of these programs, which ultimately led to the Bay of Pigs and the debacle there. There was Project Mongoose, which Bobby, to a large extent, supported, a CIA program. It didn't work. None of these programs worked, and so Bobby, in utter frustration and I think progressively becoming less trustful of the people who had been running these programs up to this point, said, I'm going to create my own program. We are going to run this out of my office, and it's going to be highly secure and highly compartmentalized, as it is to this day.
Project Freedom, again, was Bobby Kennedy's project that he ran only with his most trusted advisors. So you had Bobby at the top, based in Washington, and also based much of the time in Washington, you had his Cuban confidant. That was Bobby's main liaison with the other small handful of exile leaders that he trusted to work on Project Freedom with him. Those leaders would sometimes contact Bobby directly, but most of the time they would go through his Cuban confidant.
So a second invasion of Cuba was being planned, using a force of Cuban exiles. Robert Kennedy's Cuban confidant was the man in charge.
Harry Williams was in the invasion brigade of the Bay of Pigs, and when he was recuperated from Cuba, Bobby Kennedy tapped him to become kind of his golden boy with the exiles. And Harry, I can tell you, he has a tremendous presence, almost a charisma, if you want to call it that. And so I did interview him, and he told me that the action was going to be based out of the Dominican Republic in a place called Monte Cristi. But the character changed when they cooperated or co-opted a high official in Havana, and the opportunity for an assassination of Castro and a coup presented itself. So this developed along the line, and at that point the second invasion became more of a backup type of idea. John Kennedy, in his settlement with Premier Khrushchev the Soviet Union, the missile crisis in October of 1962, had agreed that there would be no U.S. involvement in any type of adverse actions against Cuba. That was part of the agreement. So this had to be kept from the Soviet Union, it had to be kept from the FBI, it had to be kept from anybody and anybody that didn't have a need to know. Harry was reporting directly to Bobby Kennedy.
The United States in the summer and fall of 1963 had a great need to get more low-level intelligence assets into Cuba. One of the reasons the Bay of Pigs had failed was because we didn't have good intelligence that told us what the reaction of the Cuban people really would be when the invasion happened. Well, Bobby Kennedy was determined not to let that happen again. So there was a general effort throughout the summer and fall of 1963 to get people into Cuba by legitimate means, not by secret boats in the middle of the night, as the CIA was capable of doing, but these would be people who would go in legitimately, would be able to walk the streets, talk to people, because this was very important for Project Freedom. They had to have ways of finding out what the man on the street thought about the coup, if they were going to support the new leaders, and indeed there were many, many mysterious visits by young men in their early 20s to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City trying to get into Cuba for those kinds of activities.
Oswald supposedly returned from a trip to Mexico City, a very enigmatic trip, in which he made loud noises about getting a visa to Cuba at both the Soviet and the Cuban embassies there, and created quite a ruckus when he was turned down. This again established his bona fides as a Castro partisan. And I'm sure if it was actually Oswald, because there's a lot of evidence that it was not he, but a double that showed up down there. In any event, his bona fides as a Castro revolutionary were established. And upon his return to Dallas, he was in essentially the same role that he had been in New Orleans, being dangled in this ongoing intelligence operation. And the final denouement, of course, was that this intelligence operation in which he was being controlled simply set him up to take the tumble for the presidential assassination. They controlled him, and that's where he wound up, in the Dallas School Book building. And he was simply, like he said in his own words, the patsy.
Thom and Lamar's detailed study of recently declassified documents has revealed a secret plan, part of Project Freedom, that was hijacked by Kennedy's killers, enabling them to escape detection.
Beginning in September of 1963, several agencies of the U.S. government, at Bobby Kennedy's direction, began making contingency plans regarding Project Freedom. They were worried about what would happen if Castro found out about the plan and retaliated in some way.
And so Bobby was faced with a serious problem here. He had a plan that had a very good chance of actually unseating Castro. What if Castro found out about it? And what if Castro found out about it before it happened and launched a preemptive attack of some sort against the United States? Not a military attack, but some sort of a hit-and-run thing. What if he were, for example, to assassinate the U.S. ambassador to Panama or to Guatemala or something like this? And so Bobby had his advisors put together a series of contingency plans around this Cuban operation, these Cuba contingency plans by the State Department, the FBI, the CIA, the Defense Department, people involved in them like Alexander Haig and Joseph Califano, who put together this program that this is how we're going to respond if Castro does something against us, if he kills one of our people. And we want to very carefully control the release of information about the evidence. We want to control the evidence in a way that we can prevent inflammatory information from getting out that would cause the press to go nuts, that would cause the Republicans to use this as a political tool that would cause Americans to demand an immediate invasion of Cuba that could lead to World War III. They had to have control of the information.
There were very low-level operatives and informants working for the CIA whose primary allegiance was to the mafia. And these people had been working with the mafia for much longer than they had been working with the CIA, and the mafia paid them many, many times what the CIA did. Those people not only told the mafia bosses like Trafficante and Marcello about Project Freedom, but they worked with the mafia in ways to use those plans to kill President Kennedy and use the secrecy surrounding Project Freedom to cover up the mafia's role in it.
Dangling Oswald, the forces involved, I'm firmly convinced, were the same ones that were involved in the ongoing attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. And I'm talking about the combination or the alliance between the CIA and the mafia to snuff Castro. And I think that what happened at Dallas was simply that having the personnel and the teams assembled for assassination, having the wherewithal to do it, having the intelligence connections to cover it up, that they simply turned their guns on Kennedy, and that's where it all came from, out of that whole collaboration between the mob and the CIA and some of the Cuban exiles. And I probably should add rogue elements of the CIA, because I know that the director himself, who was a Kennedy appointee, certainly was not involved.
One of the more startling bits of evidence that Oswald was either a member of Project Freedom, part of the program, or that he had been manipulated in such a way that Bobby Kennedy was certain that he was, is found in an article written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who was in Washington, D.C. with one of the leaders of Project Freedom just hours after the assassination. And he received a telephone call from Bobby Kennedy just a few hours after Jack was killed, and Bobby's comment to him was, one of your guys did it. One of your guys just killed my brother. And this clearly demonstrates that Bobby's first response was that he recognized either Oswald's name or Oswald's position, and that he believed that Project Freedom had been breached. And this also shows us how and why the Cuba contingency plans were immediately invoked, why the government would go to the lengths that it went to violate state and federal law to seize John Kennedy's body from Dallas, take it to a federal facility in Bethesda, and on, all the other things. All of a sudden, it all makes sense.
We know from sources who were actually working on Project Freedom that Robert Kennedy directed, through intermediaries, certain activities at the autopsy to make sure that national security considerations were observed with respect to the autopsy. And these considerations extended even after the autopsy was finished.
Immediately after the autopsy, the body was then delivered into the care of then Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig, later Secretary of State Alexander Haig. And Haig, of course, was one of the authors of one of the Cuba contingency plans. It's very clear from all the conversations we've had with the people who were close to Bobby at that time that he believed, at least in those early days, possibly weeks, that his program that he was responsible for, that he was running, had somehow been turned around or compromised and used to murder his brother, that he bore some personal level of responsibility for the death of his brother.
I am very convinced that the assassination of John F. Kennedy came from the collaboration between the CIA and the Mafia in attempting to assassinate Fidel Castro. And I feel very strongly that that apparatus that was set up to assassinate Castro simply was turned on Kennedy when the motive piled upon motive to get rid of him. If the truth came out today about what really happened, it certainly would be a major embarrassment to a number of political and media figures. And I find that to be a very healthy thing. I think that people in this country should know how the government is able to cover up things that went on, not always by people being guiltily involved, but by just going along with what the government says.